Well, hey there everyone. My name is Daniel and I'm the online campus pastor here at OAG. I am excited for today's podcast because this is from our series entitled Before You Knew Me. This will be stories and testimonies shared from folks just like you and our own church family. So sit back and relax and be inspired by what God has done and is still doing in the lives of His children.
You know, when Pastor first asked me if I'd like to share my story, I was kind of surprised for a couple of reasons. First off, I'm 82 years old, and any old man likes to share his story with anybody that'll listen, and so that was kind of fun. And secondly, I've been known as a verbal Vesuvius, and he's taken a chance, and he may well have to come up tonight and tell us it's time to go home. And by the way, Vesuvius is the name of the volcano that covered the ancient city of Pompeii. And just so you all know, I'm really proud of my humility. So don't forget that while I'm talking here. Okay, a while back, a buddy and I were fishing in a rubber inflatable boat of his on the Dead River out of Lake Griffin State Park. And a little 3-foot gator was cruising across the river up a bit from us. I could have sworn I heard, "Good thing you can't cast that far." Oh wait, that's the wrong story. Just a minute. Here we go. I'm sort of the middle son of a preacher of sorts. So being the middle child and a preacher's kid besides is as good an excuse as any for my socially unacceptable behavior as a kid, huh? See, my oldest brother, there were 4 of us total, was my half-brother whose mama died when he was about 6 or so and was 16 years older than me, so he didn't really count in my world. My mom, who was a school teacher, had 3 boys with my dad. The first one was 8 years older than me, and my younger brother was 4 years my junior. And my dad was a prominent leader in the local branch church that doesn't have preachers per se, but he played that role in the church and actually became a lobbyist for the church at the state capitol in Sacramento, California. Well, not really. Lobbyists at that time were illegal in the state of California, so he was a legislative advocate, okay? So that was my defense, being the middle kid in the PK when I found myself in dire straits as a kid while growing up. But before I go on much more about myself, let me brag a little bit about the bride. Barbie, would you stand up so that people can see who it is I'm talking about? Yes. Barbie was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, late in 1943, to a great Catholic family of French Canadians. She's number 5 of 6 girls born to her parents. She attended Catholic schools through high school and was the star forward on the basketball team. And consequently, she's adept at doing things that are useful, like taking shorthand, typing very fast, and knowing where to put the apostrophe. She even learned there were parts of speech, what I found was amazing. And all that prepared her for her job as a secretary with the Air Force at Hanscom Field in Massachusetts. And while she was there, she was attracted to the travel stories that the crews of the airplanes were telling. So as soon as she turned 21, she applied for overseas duty. And because she's bilingual and speaks French, she got to go to France. And when de Gaulle threw the Americans out of France, she was assigned to the Air Force base in Wiesbaden, Germany. And she spent a total of about 4 years working and traveling in Europe. She came home to Lowell, and as soon as her car arrived, which was a 1965 Volkswagen Bug that she'd paid cash for, and she still has the receipt. She's a good secretary, remember? As a matter of fact, she's such a good secretary that she earned her Certified Professional Secretary classification. That was several years of classroom study and the passing of 6 different tests to get that certificate. And anyway, when the car arrived, she drove it by herself across the U.S. to Sacramento, California, where her job in the legal department for the Air Force at McClellan Field was waiting for her. And while she was there, we met and married. I was raised by loving parents and had an economically comfortable life. My folks were solid members in the Christian Science religion. Let me quote Wikipedia here. There are key differences between Christian Science theology and that of traditional Christianity. In particular, adherents subscribe to a radical form of philosophical idealism, believing that reality is purely spiritual and the material world an illusion. This includes the view that disease is a mental error rather than a physical disorder, and that the sick should be treated not by medicine but by a form of prayer that seeks to correct the beliefs responsible for the illusion of ill health. And that's the end of the quote. The religion is often called a cult because the adherents to the religion do not view God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus as a single entity as we more traditional Christians do. There are many other things about Christian Science that can make life difficult for a kid, but I want to emphasize that I harbor no ill will toward any adherents to the religion. And in fact, we have family that we dearly love who are devout followers. Early on, I disagreed with most of the teachings, particularly the idea that this material world we live in is an illusion. In no way was I going to believe that it was my thinking that made my thumb hurt when I accidentally smacked it with a hammer. The incident that clinched it for me was when I was 9 years old and happened when the family was camping by a trout-filled stream, and I'd run out of the local larva stage of a damselfly called hellgrammites to use for bait. But I had noticed that the trout were quick to grab a hornet that landed on the water by mistake. I was told that because God had created everything and it was all good, the hornet and I were both in harmony with one another and no harm would come of our interaction. Only thing is, the hornet didn't know that. And when I grabbed one to use it as bait, it both bit me and stung me. And I felt lied to by my parents. Now, if you can't trust your parents to tell you the truth, who can you trust? I'd already written off my brothers because they were always helping me get into trouble. So I simply lived a very compartmental life. As long as I lived at home, I pretended to go along with the religious stuff, but I knew it was false. I didn't know what was true. And after I left home, I also left church, religion, and that whole issue. I had no trouble believing there was a God of some sort because as I studied nature, it seemed easy to believe in some kind of a divine creation. Additionally, I had some real personal reasons to believe in the existence of a supreme being. While in the Navy, working as an electrician in 1963, I experienced severe facial burns from a huge electrical flash that knocked the ship's power offline when a live 440-volt cable that I was taping up shorted out. My eyelids were stuck together, and the skin on my face felt to my fingers like a burnt steak as they carried me off to the hospital ship that was in port at the same time we were in Long Beach, California. The doctors on the hospital ship immediately sent me to the civilian hospital there in Long Beach, and that evening when I was examined by the eye specialist, I was told that I may lose one or both eyes to prevent infection from getting to my brain and killing me. At that time in my life, I'd never heard anybody praying out loud other than to repeat the Lord's Prayer. So I had no idea how to talk to God, but to the best of my ability, I appealed to Him anyway, asking for healing, and He obviously healed me. The doctors were amazed that I could tell the difference between dark and light a day later when they said I had scrambled eggs for retinas. And today, there aren't even any scars. Amen. In the winter of 1965, I was working for the phone company as a part of a group that took care of public phones. Remember payphones? If you do, you're mature. Another fellow and I were on our way from Sacramento to Truckee, California to do some survey work. And on Highway 80 by Donner Pass, the snow was particularly heavy. There were 2 lanes open with 10 to 15-foot snowbanks on each side. Occasionally there were pullouts, and when my passenger Dennis asked me to pull over at the next one, I assumed he needed to relieve himself, so I pulled over. As soon as I was off the road, a Wonder Bread truck came whizzing by sideways using both lanes. I told Dennis I was sure glad he asked me to pull over, and he denied saying anything. And besides, he had no reason to ask me. It was pretty easy for me to believe that God had actually spoken to me. But that was pretty much it for me and God until shortly after Barb and I were married in 1970. By then, I'd been through a horrible divorce, had lost everything, and was convinced I'd never marry again. After the separation of my first wife, I discovered that I had about a 90-day limit for live-in girlfriends. Either they'd leave me because I was never home, or I'd split because I was tired of their complaining. Then Barb wouldn't move in with me unless we got married. So 5 days later, after telling me that, we got married. After 90 days, she showed no sign of leaving, and I didn't want to leave either. So I needed to figure out how to stay married. Since the marriages I'd admired all had some kind of religious component, and hanging on to this wonderful little bundle of energy and excitement I was married to was a big deal to me, we began going to different churches now and then, searching for answers. But every time we'd go to a church, it was always a turnoff for one reason or another. As a kid, my parents were big on reading, and parts of the Bible were read every day of the week, following the guidance given out by the Mother Church in Boston. There were specific verses that were dictated and corresponding parts of the book written by the founder of the religion. But I'd read the whole Bible a couple of times, and I found parts of it to be absolutely fascinating. Political power struggles, murder, all kinds of illicit sex, homosexuality, incest, rape, violence, infanticide, political intrigue, assassinations, as well as the incredible love of Jesus and the miracles he performed to prove who he was, and all kinds of fun stuff. But you know, I couldn't find the word Methodist in there. I couldn't find Episcopal or Congregationalist. And while the word Baptist is in there, it didn't relate to any of the church we visited, and there was no way I was going to go along with something that made no sense to me. I suspect that I'd learned to really not like church at all. At the time we were married, Barb wasn't a devout follower of the church teachings from her youth, and the churches we visited just didn't seem to have anything useful to offer. We were attracted to the Mormons for a spell because of their emphasis on family, and that turned out to be great fun. In my personal opinion, their writings are wonderfully replete with love and contradictions and outright plagiarism, but what kept us from joining them were 2 things. At the time, only white men could become part of the priesthood, and there was no way I was going to sign up for an organization that belittled anybody based on race. And secondly, as the man in the marriage, I was supposed to make all the decisions. And if you think Barb is quiet and submissive, you'd be greatly mistaken. That little lady's afraid of nothing, especially me. And I'm not making unilateral decisions regarding our life in any way, shape, or form. Now, don't get me wrong. We have family who are devout Mormons, and we love them unconditionally. Let's face it, some people actually like strawberry ice cream, but I'll still take my chocolate, and we're not going to fight about anything. In 1978, the guy across the street from our place in Anchorage came over and asked me what I knew about Amway. I almost locked the door so he couldn't get out. I'd heard about it because as a real estate agent, I'd sold a very large alfalfa ranch to a Boeing engineer who paid cash for the place. When I asked him where an engineer got that kind of money, he told me he had a little side business called Amway, and he'd tell me about it sometime, but he never did. Needless to say, it wasn't long before Barb and I began to sell soap on a spare time basis, and consequently had a lot of fun doing it. We met wonderful people, we loved the product, and a bit later, I did some other business stuff with another distributor, and as we left the meeting, this fellow stopped on the sidewalk and looked down at me, yeah, he was a big guy, and told me I needed to stop loving money and using people and start loving people and using money. I was stunned. Here, I just helped this guy make some money, and he was yelling at me for it. It made no sense to me at first, but as I pondered what he said, I couldn't deny he was right, maybe. So later I pursued it a bit with him, and he told me he was a Christian. And I told him I was a Welshman with some Irish and English thrown in there as well. So what? I'm not sure what he said in response, but the point of the exchange was that he was somehow different from the average guy, and in a good way. Excuse me. There, that'll keep it working. In July of 1981, when we were preparing to leave Anchorage and drive down the Alaska-Canada highway to go back to living in the Seattle area, this guy gave us some cassette tapes, which we listened to while we were on the road. One of them was called The Satan Seller, and was essentially the testimony of a guy who'd been converted to Christianity after being a Satanist. The whole thing fascinated me, but I had no idea what to do about it or how to get my multiple questions answered. Shortly after getting settled in Seattle, the daughter of a good friend going to the University of Washington gave me a book called Your God Is Not Big Enough. She had left Christian Science and become a born-again Christian. By the time I had finished the book, it looked like it had survived a tornado. It teased me, and I despised it, but I couldn't put it down. Because we'd achieved the level of success with our Amway business, which we left in Anchorage, choosing not to pursue it in the Seattle area, we were invited to a weekend seminar in Vancouver, BC. And while we were there, we were asked to attend the Sunday service because some folks wanted to meet us and chat a bit. So we went and sat in the front row. The speaker was called the Aqua Velva Man and had been the main TV pitchman for the aftershave, and his name was Jim Galbraith. Jim was almost casual in telling us his story about all he had done to fill the ever-present void he'd felt in his life. While different in details, my life duplicated his in that search. He told us that by believing in Jesus, the void was filled, and he invited anybody who felt there was something missing in their life and knew there was a void in their lives to join him in a simple prayer. And I prayed that prayer with him. Afterward, Barb and I went up to thank him, and I told him I'd prayed that prayer with him, and he was happy for me and told me that now I needed to go find a good church to follow up on it. My heart sank. For 13 years, off and on, Barb and I had tried to find a good church. And as far as I was concerned, the words good and church didn't belong in the same sentence. And as we left the meeting, I felt a bit of a letdown, but I knew I'd have to do something with what I'd learned and how and why that void was suddenly not nearly as strong. About a week or so later, I had a lunch meeting with a business associate, and he asked me what I was going to be doing the following Sunday. I thought for a moment and told him that since the Seahawks weren't playing, I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing. And he invited us to join him at church, and I flat out told him what I thought of churches, and he didn't bat an eye. He just told me that I'd hear some of the best music in town, I'd love the preacher because he'd go for the clothes 3 times, and he'd like us to meet his new wife, and that he'd go buy lunch afterward. That clinched it. A couple of things actually appealed to me about that church. First off, the music was great. There was about a 20-piece orchestra and twice that many in the choir, and the preacher's name was Bob. And while I later learned he had several educational degrees, he didn't advertise it. He wasn't wearing a costume that made me think he thought he was better than the rest of us. He was just wearing a suit like mine. And during the sermon, he actually asked us to pray for him. He said his office window overlooks the lake and the beach, and he didn't need to be distracted by the pretty girls. And as promised, he made sure that guys like me were invited to the altar 3 times. I hung on to the back of the pew in front of me till my fingernails turned white. There was no way I was going to get sucked into something I didn't understand by some smooth-talking preacher. As we were following my friend and his new wife to lunch, I mentioned to Barb I'd never in my life been sitting in a church for 90 minutes without wishing I were somewhere else. She denied it had been that long until she looked at her watch, and then we both laughed. We went again the next Sunday and filled out the guest card just to see what would happen. They had a baptism like ours here, and everybody clapped and then sang that old "I Have Decided to Follow Jesus" song. And my heart sank again. How can I get baptized without the applause? I love applause. I'll do almost anything for it, but not this. It's just all right. At home in my office midweek, I got a call canceling an evening appointment I had, and as I was leaving the office to tell Barb, the phone rang again. It was the church office calling, asking if it was okay if Bob came to visit that same night that I just had the cancellation, and I accepted. Then as I was leaving, I got another call. This one was from my mom. During the course of conversation, I told her that I thought Barb and I had finally found a church we liked, and she expressed joy for us. It had obviously been a concern to her and my dad that I turned my back on the whole church thing. When Bob came to our place, he had a friend with him, a guy we learned who was dying of brain cancer. It was an amiable chat. Bob learned about Barb being raised a Catholic and us hearing Jim Galbraith and me praying with him, and he asked if we wanted to be water baptized. I balked and told him my issue. He said, that was no problem at all, let's go right now. That night, right then. So Barb and I were baptized by Bob with his friend and an electrician working on some lighting issues as our only witnesses, and there wasn't any applause, at least not that I could hear. See how God works things out for us if we only surrender to Him? One of the soft requirements for membership in this church was participation in a small group Bible study, as well as taking a New Believers class. The New Believers class was a hoot. It was taught by a really nice old guy by the name of Woody Phillips. I was kind of quiet the first session or so, and then I began to ask Woody some questions about the apparent conflicts in Scripture. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but Woody said, well, Dave, I like the way the old Greeks wrote that. And then from memory, he repeated it in Greek and then translated it for me. And I may have had one or two other questions for Woody before I found out that he was the retired president of the Multnomah Bible College. Talk about getting my answers from the proper end of the horse. Oh. The small group Bible study was just as much fun for us. I knew stories from the Bible that Barbie'd never heard of, and she had doctrinal truths from her catechism that gave me silly, simple answers and took care of some sticky issues for me. The study folks were mostly older folks, and we were studying something about finance, and they all seemed to be having difficulty in that regard, while Barb and I were actually doing rather well. When I privately asked the leader about that, he made some casual remark about God sometimes testing us in the areas we feel strongest in. And then about 2.5 years later, we were flat broke and struggling like crazy to keep our heads above water. And I decided it was a bad idea to question God about how He does things and just go with the flow. I had 2 significant projects go belly up at the same time. One was a 48-house subdivision, and I had 2 partners in it with me. One was a general contractor with good experience that I'd known for a while, and the other was a mortgage banker that was well known and respected in the community. When the project failed, both of them went bankrupt, which left me holding the bag. And the other was a hotel, restaurant, and bar in Alaska that my main business partner and I had bought. They got into trouble as well. When my partner and I moved into the hotel with our wives to try to save it, we displaced 9 employees. Barb was washing dishes and pots and pans in the restaurant and cleaning hotel rooms. And as the general manager, I was scurrying around trying to find new business like lunches for the local clubs. There was room for a nice RV park there, and I worked hard to convince the city fathers that it would be an asset. My partner was putting the place on computers so we could track the numbers more accurately, and his wife did the baking for the restaurant as well as doing the hotel laundry. We sponsored the local hockey team, and one night after a game, they took the rooms in the hotel that the visiting Lions Club had not taken. That was the night we had the first and only fight in the bar. And later, the hockey players were trying to break all the furniture in their rooms, and I went up and asked them to quiet down, and a couple of them picked me up, took me out to the hall, told me to run along, and I did. I was doing the night audit, and it was about 2 a.m. in the morning, and I was feeling discouraged, to say the least. So I asked God, what else did He want from me, because I was totally drained. I was at the end of my rope, but I had no more answers or ideas. What do I do? And you know what He immediately reminded me of? I'd trusted him for my salvation, but I thought I knew about running business, and I didn't need his help there. What God wanted was all of me, and that was a significant change for me. I'd like to tell you that the business turned around and became successful again, but that wasn't the case. There were a couple of loans with a local credit union and a bank, and we'd agreed to pay interest only until we got back on our feet. But they too went broke, and the government came in, wanted full payment for the loans. They wouldn't negotiate anything, and while it wasn't much, it was more than my partner and I could raise, and the business failed. As we drove down the Alaska-Canada highway again, Barb asked me to please get a job, not try business ownership anymore. And I reluctantly agreed, and God honored my agreement with her. Within 10 days of returning to the Seattle area, I was working for a very large corporation and had a nice salary to boot. Remember that guy who'd invited us to go to church with him and he'd buy our lunch? Yep, he was the one that made the arrangements for me. And a side note here, sponsors are important in life, and if you're in an employment situation and want to have upward mobility, you better have a sponsor who will pound the desk for you. And the same thing applies to you if you are a serious Christian. If you want more information about that, see me afterwards. Now, I have this gland in my neck that secretes a sticky kind of mucus-like fluid occasionally. As a kid, I'd ask my folks about that, as my dad had a similar one on the left side of his neck. And they told me it was evolutionary, and it was kind of like the dew claws on a dog, or that vestige of the second toe on a horse's leg. This gland had served as the producer of the fish's slime to keep the scales from sticking together and protect them from the bacteria. My experience in the Navy during boot camp was pretty much the same, as the doctors there wanted to get some of the fluid to study. Seems they're one of these glands in every 3 or 4 million people. 1 out of 3 or 4 million people have that. One night at our small group Bible study, it suddenly hit me that all these Christians were creationists and not environmentalists. So I asked them about this and told them the story. Never saw so many blank faces in my life. Finally, Fred, a retired veterinarian, said he didn't know the answer, but he knew who did, and he'd be praying about that for me. Okay, Fred, you pray. But not long after, I had a doctor visit at the clinic at the University of Washington, where I was a participant in a drug study, and I asked the doc about this gland in my neck. He laughed and said that the theory for years had been the fish story, but because of the advances in fluid diagnosis techniques, they found it was totally unlike any other bodily substance known at the time, fish or anything else. That was good enough for me. And about this time, I began to feel the need to deal with the anger I felt about the time I had finally heard the gospel from Jim Galbraith. Why hadn't anybody ever told me about this before now? I reflected back on that time when the Christian Amway distributor had told me I needed to stop loving money and using people. But if he told me the good news, it sure didn't click with me. So the question of what do I do with what I've got and how do I share this with others began to burn inside me. A fellow we'd met in this small group surprised me one Sunday by being baptized. So like me, he knew of Jesus, but hadn't really known Jesus. And we began meeting and studying all the commands that Jesus gave us, trying to get the answers. Talk about the blind leading the blind. Oh my goodness. We were driving ourselves crazy because it all seemed to boil down to just loving each other. But there had to be more than that, right? How do I let others know about this incredible relationship with Jesus that is theirs for their taking? Not sure how it happened, but that's when Steve Wilkins, the Metro Director for the Christian Businessmen's Committee, CBMC, came into my life. Steve took me and Ralph under his wing and began to help us deal with all these questions. They used a program called Operation Timothy that was a mentoring system to teach us how to share the gospel and then how to mentor the new believer. CBMC was a group not unlike the Full Gospel Men's Fellowship group that might be familiar to some of you. They'd have a luncheon with a popular local figure, like somebody from one of the sports teams in the Seattle area, or a well-known businessman who would be the speaker. The members would ask guys to join them for lunch, explain it was sponsored by a Christian group and we'd be praying before we'd eat, and they'd still be able to meet the speaker after lunch if they wanted. The speaker would tell about some of their life before Jesus, how they found Jesus, and their life afterward, and then invite anybody to pray what's commonly called the sinner's prayer. Each table would have an envelope with registration cards, and everybody'd fill out the card. If they'd prayed with the speaker to turn their lives over to Jesus, they'd just check the little box in the lower corner of the card. After lunch, the members would gather up the cards, and everybody who checked the box would get a visit that afternoon if possible, or at the very least, as soon as possible. 2 men paying the visit, one praying, the other talking. Amazing stories about lives being changed. Some of the city leaders had never had anybody actually care about their spirituality and where they're going to be spending eternity. It was my great pleasure to speak at some of these luncheons occasionally, not only in Seattle, but some of the surrounding communities, and there was hardly a greater joy than leading someone to Jesus. That chapter of our lives ended in 1998 when we sold or gave away nearly everything we owned and moved into the RV with plans to tour the US, Canada, and Mexico. And after 10 years of living like that and doing that kind of thing, as well as volunteer work with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Christian RV group called Servants on Wheels Ever Ready, sewers, kind of like the maps that helped turn that schoolhouse into a church. We ended up here in the Villages. We bought a house in the Villages in February of 2008 while still making RV payments. The buyer disappeared at the last minute. So, oops, I went back to work. And I worked until July of 2011. That was about the time this church was getting ready to build the building we're now enjoying. And I volunteered to look at the contracts the general contractors were going to be presenting to the building committee. The pastor innocently asked me if I'd be willing to act as project manager until they could find a real one. My knee-jerk reaction was totally negative. I don't do well working with committees. I've never been comfortable trying to get consensus. I just want to get the job and go do it and get it done. I'd learned to really dislike the words, "That's the way we've always done it here." Dealing with team meetings in the corporate world has always been a source of irritation for me. After talking it over with Barb, she suggested we meet with the pastor to see if I was missing something. Now, by this time in my life, I'd learned to pay close attention to suggestions that made no sense to me, but were important to Barb. So we met with Pastor Strickland, who assured me that the committee was advisory in nature, excuse me, and I'd be reporting to just him. I knew we'd be getting along just fine, and that if he gave me a suggestion, I should treat it just like it came from Barbie. Lots of prayer later, I accepted and was paid a stipend to be the messenger between the contractor and the church. I carried a camera and a coffee cup and had a ball watching the hand of God build this place. So how did I know it was God and not just good work? Let's go back to the committee meeting where each of the prospective contractors were going to make their pitch. I gave each contractor 20 minutes to make their presentation and handed each committee member an agenda. When calling the contractors to give them their time for their presentation, only one objected to the shortness of the presentation time, and he really pressed hard for more time, and I, of course, gave him 20 minutes. I did agree to let him get there early and set up his equipment, but that was it. His was to be the next to the last presentation. The night of the presentations, I was notified that the last presenter would not be able to attend due to some personal business. The presentations were about as expected, and after the first one was ushered out, after exactly 20 minutes, the word got around and it went fairly smoothly, with all of them assuring us they could build the building using the architectural drawings we'd given them, except for the next to the last guy, the one who had pushed so hard for more time. He had some of his crew with him, and he started out by telling us why the drawings we had would not work. Now remember, I'd given each contractor 20 minutes, no more. But this was the last presentation because of a cancellation. And when the 20 minutes were almost up, I looked around and the entire committee was keenly listening, and even some questions were being asked. and I felt the Holy Spirit telling me to let it go, which I did. And when he had finished and left the room, I told the committee to simply circle the name of the contractor they wanted us to have build the meeting for us and hand it in, no discussion, no prayer, no nothing. Every single person on that committee, and I think there were 13 of them, circled that last guy who essentially told us we couldn't use the drawings we had without major changes, and I was thrilled. This was just the first of many, many instances where the hand of God was so obvious to me in this project. While not a requirement of the contractors we interviewed, this fellow and many of his employees were strong Christians. The meetings we had as the drawings were modified to comply with our local codes, our budget, and what we felt was appropriate, were started in prayer and often ended in prayer. Sure, there were issues when differing ideas for solutions would come up, and this is appropriate during any kind of a construction project, but they were always settled harmoniously. Pastor Strickland suggested perhaps I could write something in the weekly bulletin to let folks know what was going on behind the scenes, and the building corner got started. I tried to emphasize what to pray for, what we'd accomplished, and what we hoped to accomplish. The first day I accepted the job, the pastor told me he had had a call from the city regarding the water usage issue, and perhaps I should call and try to resolve it. The call made my head swim. Apparently, we had estimated more potential usage than the city engineers had, and we instantly had a substantial savings in not only upfront fees, but onward as well. I'd never ever been on a building project where the government actually tried to make it easier and less expensive for the builder in my life. Again, the hand of God. The contractor provided surveys. Oh, would you start the slides now? The contractor provided survey stakes for the members to write favorite verses on, prayers or whatever they wanted, and we had a stake your claim day. And we all drove our stake in the ground around the perimeter of the building, laid out with tape. Later, the stakes were saved and split into 2 bundles, and they're currently buried beneath the canopies of our 2 main entrances. Under the threshold of every entry into the building, we have buried Bibles, God's Word being touched as we enter and leave the building. There's also one between that one right there, between the brick building and the gym. There's a hymnal as well as a Bible under the podium here. Most of the steel structure under the drywall has inscriptions made by the people of this church, verses, prayers, whatever. About 3 months before the contractor needed to know the colors for the carpet, chairs, paint on the wall, type of tile in the bathrooms, and all that decorative detail, he gave me this huge box of samples and asked me to have the decorating committee make the decisions and to push them so they would have the decisions made before the deadline of 90 days. This wasn't something I was excited about doing, but the committee got together to start the process, and I was praying I'd survive the meeting. I put the pile of samples on the table along with a list of things that needed decisions. We were all in the old kitchen in the brick building, and I'd hopped up on the kitchen counter to watch. I figured if things started flying around, I could just roll off on the other side and survive the meeting that way. I think it was less than 2 hours before the entire color scheme and materials had been selected. To this day, I'm still amazed at how those women worked through that process. Nobody got everything they wanted, and nobody went without getting something they wanted, and they actually acted like they had fun doing it. The hand of God again. I'll never forget the next day when I told the contractor we were done. He kind of gave me a blank stare and blinked his eyes, and we both praised God for being with us in such a tangible way. During the framing of the building, there was a change in where the refrigerator in the coffee bar was going to be placed, and that required changing where the fire extinguisher was going to live. When the general contractor heard that, he found the supervisor for the framing crew, and off we went to see how much extra work this was going to cause. The fellow who had done the work originally was with us as we measured stuff out and discovered the fire extinguisher had already been put in the new place. When asking the guy who did the work about that, he responded that for some reason it just seemed to be what he was supposed to do. More praising going on. Need I say anything about the hand of God? The county wanted us to pave the road in front of the post office because our people would be using it as part of our driveway. Didn't seem quite right because mostly it gets used by the post office customers. So with traffic studies and all kinds of research and all the statistics that I could find that might apply, off to the county office I went, armed and ready for battle. While waiting for the boss to show up, the inspector and I got to talking about Alaska fishing. And when the boss showed up, he asked if I'd ever fished in a particular area. Said he had a relative in that area who was encouraging him to come up, and the Alaska fishing conversation continued for a bit. When it was time to talk business, he listened to me, and then the inspector, and then told me he'd get back to me later. I hadn't touched all that paperwork I'd brought with me. That afternoon, I heard from the inspector who told me we didn't have to pave the road after all. Yeah, you guessed it. The hand of God was obvious again. During a test of our fire hydrant, the fire inspector in charge really rubbed my fur the wrong way. He didn't treat the guys working for him well at all. He had an attitude that just bugged me. So obviously I prayed, rather than getting in an argument with the guy, he had the power to cause major trouble for us. At a later visit, he insisted on firewalls around each of our AC units above the ceilings. That was not in the plans, and the cost of doing that was financially horrible, as well as messing with the timing for the whole project. After he left, the contractor and I did some praying on the spot because there was no clear answer that was tenable to us, and we agreed to just wait a bit. Obviously, this was mentioned in the weekly bulletin asking for the prayers of the people. Later the next week, I read in the paper where he'd been fired because of inappropriate conduct with an underage girl. While elated we'd not have to deal with this guy anymore, I found we had to pray for both him and his family. Guys accused of stuff like that don't often last long in jail. And because he was fired for cause, the family might lose all the financial benefits like the retirement funds. I never found out about the family situation, but within a few months I read where the fellow had died in jail. Heart issues, I believe. What that showed me was that sometimes when there's a lion roaring in the bushes, he has no teeth and no claws, and I can ignore him and go on about my business. But other times he does indeed have teeth and claws, and I need to step aside and let our Lord take care of him for me. There are many more examples of how God took care of things, both with the physical building issues as well as the financial situation that allowed us to pay off the loan much earlier than planned. It was my pleasure to be able to act as facility manager for a few years after the building was completed, and I even got to spend some time on the board of directors here. And thanks to other men stepping up to volunteer their high level of talent and experience, I can now spend more time with home projects. And before I wander off, I want to share one more example of God's hand at work. All my life, I've disliked the activities in two rooms of the house, the nursery and the kitchen. Neither have ever been any fun for me until lately. Recently it became obvious I needed to play a more proactive role in the kitchen. And because I love Barbie and she's been so good at it for so long, I did it. But it wasn't because I enjoyed it. As I pondered it and prayed about it, one day I was putting a meal together and the Lord showed me that I was essentially doing the same thing as if I was in the garage following directions and building something. Same process, different tools and materials. And today I'm loving the kitchen, both making the mess and cleaning it up afterward, and that's strictly the Lord changing me even at this age. Now, if you know that you have a void in your heart, something that needs satisfying, but nothing you've tried has satisfied it for any length of time, I want to encourage you to pray with me right now for Jesus to fill that void. Heavenly Father, I know I'm not perfect and never will be, and I regret that. But I believe you'll forgive me for not being perfect like you are if I'll only accept you into my life in a very real way. So right now, I ask you to fill that void I feel and help me live a life that would please you. Amen. Thanks for letting me banter a bit this evening. And oh, by the way, if you prayed that prayer and need a good church, I know of one.
On behalf of our pastor and staff here at OAG, we want to say thank you. Thank you for being a part of our ministry. We are grateful for you and the support you give our church and its ministries so that we can continue to do what God has called us to do, to be the family church for the family of God. For more content from Pastor Strickland and Oxford Assembly of God, check out our media website at oag.church/media.